This book taught me so incredibly much about the theory of narrative. I just really wanted to read a book on witches. No, I did. Oh, that just unlocked a memory. Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I wanted to recommend you a bunch of non-fiction books. Now last year, I put up a video which was titled Every Book I've Ever Rated 5 Stars. I think there was like 105 books on there. I went on this beautiful trip down memory lane looking at all of my favorite books I've ever read. And I wanted to do a kind of equivalent thing with non-fiction books. So I think I have roughly 25 here. I'm going to share them with you in the order of which I read them. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. So we're going to kick off by jumping into 2014 to 2016. These were the years of my undergrad, the commerce degree that I did, starting with On Writing by Stephen King. I have the strongest memories of sitting in like the basement level of the Bath Smith Library at the University of Adelaide, just sitting in the corner reading this book. I remember him speaking about the fact that he writes about 6 pages a day. He spoke about the car accident. He speaks about his struggles with addiction, all of these things. There was one very specific piece of advice I remember being from that book, which is never to put your writing desk in the middle of the room. King found that when he was struggling the very most with his addiction, that was when his ego was at its greatest, so his writing desk was in the middle of the room. And he found that after he beat his addiction and he moved his desk to the corner of the room, he took himself a bit less seriously, and that was a kind of metaphor for how best for him to handle his success and the fact that he was such a bestseller. And I remember reading this book and feeling like I got so much insight into what it's like to actually be a writer. The second book, this is The Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare, edited by Margareta de Grazia and Stanley Wells. I speak about the Cambridge Companion series so often. I love these books. Basically, if I'm researching a topic, if I'm doing a deep dive into something, I'll just go and look up if that topic has a Cambridge Companion and I'll go to the library and borrow it. The reason why I love the Cambridge Companion books is because each chapter is written by a different scholar. It's basically an academic journal article relating to the titular topic, but part of what's really good about these books is that they're academic and they're interesting and they're beautifully researched, but they're not written in such a way that it's really, really hard to understand. You know, it's not an exclusionary writing style. You don't need a master's degree to understand these books, which I really, really love. So this one is about Shakespeare. It is what it says on the tin. I just love the depth that you get from these books, like so much interesting information. This one is the Anthology of Classical Myth. I still reference this book. I think it's amazing. This is all the primary sources in translation. It is edited and translated by Stephen M. Trizcoma, R. Scott Smith, and Stephen Brunette. As I said, this is just the primary sources. So we have Ovid, Hesiod, Hyginus, all of the faves. Because if you didn't know this, the Greek myths do actually differ a little bit depending on which original source you're reading. So in one version, a particular god or a titan might have one set of parents, but in a different version, they might have a different set of parents. The myths might change a little bit between the different versions. It's the type of thing where you probably need some kind of companion as well. Like I read this while I was studying Greek mythology, but I love this book and I literally still go back and read it because I just find it so fascinating. Moving along to 2017, and my favorite nonfiction book from this year was A Room of One's Own, which, hold on. It's not on my non-fiction shelf, it's on my Virginia Woolf shelf. This book, A Room of One's Own, I originally read the ebook of this because I was living in Japan. A Room of One's Own is a really famous book written by Virginia Woolf, and it is essentially Woolf's meditation on what it is to be a writer who is female at this time. This is from the early 1900s, so obviously compared to discourse on gender today, there are a few limited things in here, but I love this book. It's so ahead of its time. The writing itself is just absolutely gorgeous. Like you kind of forget you're reading a non-fiction book. Like Woolf is such a genius when it comes to her prose. This topic is so beautifully examined by her. She considers, you know, what would have happened if Shakespeare had have had a sister who was equally as talented. This is a really, really important and influential book when it comes to discourse on gender. In 2017, in addition to moving to Japan, I also started my postgrad in writing and literature, and for this I read the Literary Theory Handbook. This is such a niche one. Like you don't need to read, like if you're interested in writing, don't bother with this. You don't need to read this unless you're actually doing like a postgrad and you're really looking into literary theory, which is just a whole kettle of fish that people don't necessarily need to dive into. But it was really fascinating. I loved reading this book. I thought it was really interesting. I felt like I learned a lot from it. It is a lot harder to read than something like one of the Cambridge Companion books, but I found it incredibly fascinating. From this book, I learned about Walter Benjamin. No, I did. Oh, that just unlocked a memory. I did an essay where my first essay for literary theory, I called Walter Benjamin Walter about 50% of the time. And also in that essay, I referred to Honoré de Balzac a bunch of times, but I accidentally mixed up the Z and the S in his name through the whole essay. Oh! I did not get a good grade for that one, but it's okay. Actually, that was also the assignment that I had where the academic was really, really mean and snobby. So honestly, I look back on it and it's just funny. Also very, very expensive. Do not buy this book. Borrow it from a library. This one is my favorite from the Cambridge Companion series, and it is the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature, edited by Edward James and Farah Mendelssohn. If you're studying fantasy literature at an academic level, you tend to see Farah Mendelssohn's name pop up a lot. I love this book. I thought it provided such amazing context for the fantasy genre from a literary lens. It looks at Tolkien, it looks at Angela Carter, it looks at so many different aspects of fantasy literature that I'm really interested in. This was a Christmas present from Tyler. I love this book. This one's one of my favorite academic books of all time. I've also read the Cambridge Companion to Gothic, also to children's literature. I love all of them and they're all really great. The next book is The Invention of Angela Carter by Edmund Gordon. This is a biography of Angela Carter's life. She's one of my favorite writers. I read this book during a very tumultuous time. I just moved home to Australia. I was unemployed. It was a really liminal, sad time for me, and I spent so much time at the library, and I borrowed this book from the Adelaide City Library and I just loved it. I remember crying at the end. Angela Carter's life was cut short because she had lung cancer, I'm pretty sure, but it was just such an interesting exploration of her life. She lived in Japan. She taught briefly at the University of Adelaide. There's just so much interesting stuff in this book and I love it. Moving along to 2019, the first book I want to talk about is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Since reading this book, I've heard a lot of criticism for the book of people saying like, oh, it's not accurate and all of this stuff, and like read this book instead because it's more accurate. I do not know because I'm not a scientist, but I read Sapiens and I loved it. I thought it was so good. Sapiens is essentially a really brief history of humanity and us from the hunter-gatherer time up until now. It provided such a wonderful insight into why we do certain things and why we have certain structures. I listened to the audiobook for this and I was just enthralled the entire way. I also tried to pick up Homo Deus, I believe, like the book of the future, and I started reading it in 2021, and I think like the first sentence is that we will never have another pandemic. Because that book obviously came out before the pandemic, and I found that so funny that I DNF'd it straight away because I was like, no, I can't trust anything you have to, because the first chapter's wrong, then like where do we go from here? But yeah, Sapiens I loved. I thought it was amazing. If you're in the camp of people who think it's not factually accurate, fair enough. I'm sorry. I loved it though, so if you have any other recommendations on books like Sapiens, please let me know what to read instead because I love history. Narratology, Introduction to the Theory of Narrative by Miek Bal. I read this book in chapters here and there, borrowed it from the library. It's a really, really expensive textbook. This book taught me so incredibly much about the theory of narrative. Like so much of what we do with language is tacit. We pick up some of these things really subconsciously as we're reading books, you know, as we're growing up. And so actually getting to learn the theory behind some of these things was absolutely fascinating. I loved it so much. I loved especially learning about focalizers. And so I think that's the thing that's really stuck with me the most. A focalizer is essentially a fancy way of saying the point of view of the narration. Your focalizer is the being that's actually perceiving the world, right? And so focalizers are really important because if your focalizer is someone who's educated, they're going to describe things in a very different way to someone who isn't educated about a particular topic. For example, if you're reading a book that's first person limited, your focalizer is only that person whose consciousness was seeing the story through. But if you're reading a book like Lord of the Rings, for example, which has omniscient narration, the focalizer can be anyone in the story. And just examining this concept of the focalizer of a story, I found it so useful for my writing. Moving along to 2020, everyone's favorite year. The first book I want to talk about is Educated by Tara Westover. I loved this memoir. In Educated, Tara Westover tells the story of her childhood, the fact that she was raised by a family who had some very controlling behaviors. They were super abusive. She had this childhood where she was very isolated from the community around her. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She wasn't allowed to seek medical attention. This was quite an extreme Mormon family who were preparing for the ends of days, and so Tara examines her childhood where she was so cut off from the people around her and raised in this very abusive situation, and how she manages to claw herself out of this situation and eventually go off to college. Like she never went to primary school and somehow she still ended up with a college degree, and so she has to eventually estrange herself from her family and build a life for herself and heal from everything that happened. And I just found this book so harrowing and emotional and moving. I loved it so much. I'd really like to reread it. I listened to the audiobook and there were just moments where I just had to stop what I was doing and just sit there and listen to parts of her story because it was so moving and so inspiring. And I loved this book. I think it's so amazing. Please go read it. Ghost Empire by Richard Feidler. I originally listened to the audiobook for this as I was walking to work, I believe, in tech, because I did work in the arts and then the pandemic hit and then it wasn't a great time. And so I moved over and started working in tech, and I had like a 45-minute walk to work every day. And so I listened to a lot of audiobooks. I started ramping up my audiobook reading quite a bit in 2020 and 2021 because of this. But anyway, I listened to Ghost Empire by Richard Feidler, which is a history book about the Byzantine Empire, specifically Constantinople, which is of course the city we now know as Istanbul in Turkey. I loved this book so much. I didn't really expect to, but on one of my videos I uploaded to YouTube, one of you guys commented that you loved this book and it was one of your favorite things you've ever read. And I thought, oh, Byzantine Empire, that sounds interesting. I didn't expect to fall in love with the book, and now it's one of my favorite books of all time. To whoever that person was, thank you so incredibly much for your book recommendation. This book weaves together the history of Constantinople with the trip that the author took with his son in 2016, I believe, to Istanbul. It kind of beautifully weaves together the history of the ancient city with the city that it is now, and there's just so much interesting stuff in here. I've mentioned this book to death. I love it so much. Ghost Empire by Richard Feidler. Such a good book. Such a good history book. Moving on to 2021, and the first book I want to speak about is What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. I thought this was absolutely amazing. I found it really harrowing. I found it really fascinating. This is essentially a book that examines what trauma does to the brain, so particularly childhood trauma. A bit of a word of warning here, and I probably should have given this warning on Educated as well, that these books contain themes of abuse, especially child abuse. And so in this book, What Happened to You, there are real world examples. So if that's a really, really tricky topic for you, I would suggest you tread carefully, maybe look up content warnings for this one. I found this book really insightful and moving, and I just got so much out of reading this book. And essentially it just looks at trauma and how trauma affects the brain and how people heal from trauma. And it was just overall fascinating. If you're interested in psychology, I so recommend it. This one is The Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic. The reason why I got this book is because I actually wanted the Cambridge Companion of Witchcraft and Magic, but this one actually got better reviews, and the Cambridge Companion was really, really hard to find. It's been one of the rare ones I haven't been able to find from the library. I just really wanted to read a book on witches. I was in the early stages of writing Project Teacup, which features witches in it. I just wanted to do some research. I actually got to see this painting. I'm pretty sure it's in the Louvre. I've been to a lot of art galleries in the past 12 months. I did see it in person, I know for sure. We walked past it and the painting is huge, and I was like, oh my god, Tyler, that's the painting from my book. So same exact thing with the Cambridge Companion books. I love that this book is split into different scholarly articles on this topic. Really accessible to read, really engaging, really fun and interesting, and with a lot of academic depth as well, which I appreciated. Those of you who know my channel well, who know me well, have probably been sitting here waiting for me to bring up this book, which is Starting Point by Hayao Miyazaki. This is a compilation of his essays from 1979 to 1996. I'll also chuck in Turning Point, which is basically like the same exact thing, but it's 1997 to 2008. This book is almost literally half about Princess Mononoke, which I love Princess Mononoke, not knocking her, love her, beautiful, beautiful film, one of my favorites of all time. However, there is a picture of Hal and Sophie from House Moving Castle, and what I wanted is depth on House Moving Castle. Curse of the Were-Rabbit is mentioned more in this book than House Moving Castle is, and so that's my only gripe. The essays themselves are still really interesting and really insightful. So yeah, this is a compilation of his essays, his articles, a few of his speeches. I honestly just love reading Hayao Miyazaki's work and his words. He's such a fascinating person. I think he has such an interesting perspective on the world. So much of what he says is really contradictory. The way he looks at war and the environment and film and animation in this book is wonderful and so interesting, and I love this. I've reread this 2 or 3 times, I'm pretty sure. I just pick up and read certain sections. It's a really, really cool book. The next one is Sagaland by Richard Feidler and Kauri Gusleson. I read Sagaland because I also love Ghost Empire, obviously. Sagaland is a little bit of a different concept. So Kauri is Icelandic, but he grew up in Australia, and it's written between the 2 authors, and it's kind of based on a trip they took to Iceland, and it examines the Icelandic sagas, which are the kind of the traditional stories of Iceland, which I loved. I loved that concept. I thought it was so interesting. Oh, I cannot remember. I had this one specific saga saga that I loved the most, which I cannot remember the name of, but it was about this woman who had multiple husbands, and the last line of the saga was that she was like, this woman was the cruelest to the person she loved the most, and that line has just stuck with me. So I need to reread this book, and I need to put that line in my commonplace book. If you've seen my commonplace book video, I'm now doing this thing where I'm collecting quotes and writing them down, and I love that quote and I remember it really strongly, but I did really, really love it. And if you're interested in Iceland, I definitely recommend you checking it out. The next book is called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. This is a really interesting book about negotiating. I read it when I was working in tech, and then my boss read it, and then one of my other friends read it, and then basically got to the point where everyone in the office had read it. And so it was kind of hilarious because like if anyone was trying to negotiate anything with each other, it was a moot point because everyone had read this book. Became a bit of a meme, like it was so silly. And then you'd see someone in the office like talking to someone trying to negotiate something, and you'd be like, ah, there's that technique. Anyway, I enjoyed this book. I do think I got quite a bit out of it. If you work in a professional environment, especially if you're a person who is conflict avoidant, I so recommend reading this book. The next book is What I Talk About When I Talk About Running by Haruki Murakami. And also, I'm just going to pop in Novelist as Vocation, also by Haruki Murakami. I read this book last year, I'm pretty sure, but let's just talk about them together to make this a little bit more easy. Because basically, this book is just an extension of this book to my mind. So What I Talk About When I Talk About Running is a memoir by Haruki Murakami, where he meditates on the concept of running a marathon being similar to writing a novel or being a novelist generally. I really liked reading about Haruki Murakami's backstory and how he became a novelist, the time he spent working at a jazz bar, how he submitted his first novels. All of that context was really interesting. And also generally, I just love the way he writes. Like he's such a beautiful writer, so engaging, and just does an absolutely amazing job. This book, honestly, Novelist as Vocation, just kind of feels like it goes a bit deeper than What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, because What I Talk About When I Talk About Running features a lot of stuff about running. It features a lot of his marathon training, time he spent living in the US, but Novelist as Vocation is a little bit more centered on writing itself because it doesn't have the added concept of like running being a metaphor for writing. Both of these books are wonderful, so lovely to read. If he wrote a third memoir on writing, I'd read that too. He's just an amazing author. It's 2021 I read this book and I thought it was wonderful, and then I read this book last year, I think. The next book is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I found this book so interesting. I went through a period of time where I was just reading book after book on nature and plants and stuff like that, and I was really struggling because I could never find anything that was actually engaging and that was actually holding my attention. And then I picked up this book and I just thought it was such a fascinating perspective. So Robin Wall Kimmerer is a Native American author and botanist, and in this book she examines her experiences of being a Native American scientist and academic, and she also explores elements of horticulture in North America for obvious reasons, the main one being that I'm from Australia, a country in the Southern Hemisphere, which is a long way away from America. I've never really known anything about horticulture in the US, and I feel like I learned so much. I didn't realize that strawberries were native to North America, and in the book the author also talks about the indigenous practice of, I think it's putting 3 different crops together, so I think it's like squash, something and something else, but basically the fact that if you plant 3 different crops in a specific kind of way, the crops help to propagate each other. I do want to pick it back up and reread it because I felt like I got so much out of it and I felt like I learned a lot. The next book is called Why We Sleep by Matt Walker. I really enjoyed this book. I found the sections on sleep disorders really, really interesting, particularly because I am a person who sleepwalks quite a lot. I sleepwalk, I sleep talk. It is a little bit chaotic and it's been quite funny at many different points in my life, but yeah, I found this book really interesting. I think sleep is very, very important to the brain, to cognition, to all of those kinds of things. Moving on to 2022, and the first book I want to talk about is called Onibi, Diary of a Yokai Ghost Hunter by Atelier Sento, which is 2 French illustrators whose actual names I forget, but it's 2 people. And I really loved this book. Like, this book is kind of like a graphic memoir. Like, there's little bits of this which are kind of not 100% necessarily real, but it's about this couple in the Japanese countryside who are going on a bit of a journey to explore the concept of the yokai, and they're sort of like looking for yokai, and it's very lighthearted and it's very beautiful. The illustrations are just gorgeous. So gorgeous in this book. I love them so much. I really love this very like watercolor, textured, like pencil drawing style. The illustrations are very cute. I would love to make something like this one day. I loved this book. I think it's so adorable. I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I love this book. I listened to the audiobook, which is Jeanette reading it. Again, just like educated by Tara Westover. We've got themes of child abuse here. We've got themes of familial estrangement here. Jeanette McCurdy, if you didn't know, was on the TV show iCarly, which was on Nickelodeon. I was not a Foxtel kid. So in Australia, one of the key markers of class is whether or not you had Foxtel. So Foxtel is like the paid TV service. And so I never grew up watching these shows because I never had access to Foxtel when I was a kid, but I did know of iCarly because I knew other people were watching it. And so although I never watched iCarly directly, I did know of Jeanette McCurdy. And so in this book, she looks at her experiences of being a child star. She also struggled with disordered eating and bulimia. And so that's covered in the story as well as another important content warning there. But mostly it focuses on her relationship with her mother. Her mother was very narcissistic, very controlling, could snap and turn and be really mean. And so I just, the process of reading this book I found really meaningful. I went on a deep dive watching the interviews that Jeanette did, and God, I just felt so bad for her. Like, she did the press tour for this book, and so many of the interviewers just didn't really treat her with the compassion and grace that she deserved. I think because the title is so provocative, but I think that, like, if you've read the book, I don't see how you could possibly find that title offensive. And it talks about like the fact that only once her mother passed away did she have the freedom to really be who she is and to not, you know, be fearful anymore of the things that her mother would do. So this book meant a lot to me. I really, really enjoyed reading it, and I so recommend it. The next one I've recently mentioned, and this is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I listened to the audiobook version, I think at the very end of 2022, which is obviously John Green reading it. This is the audiobook that I will just put on if I'm on a plane ride and I just don't feel like listening to anything. I'll just put on The Anthropocene Reviewed because all of the different essays in here are so fun. They're so engaging. They're so beautifully written. So the concept for this book, The Anthropocene Reviewed, is that John Green is reviewing different facets of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is the time in which humans are perceiving the world. John Green reviews everything from sunsets to Dr. Pepper to buffalo grass to the theme song of the Liverpool Football Club, which is Auld Lang Syne. I didn't realize. It's also the same song that they play in Japan in shops when the shops are shutting. Beautiful and moving, and I love John Green's writing so much, and this is a really good book to gift to people as well. Moving along to 2023, and the first book I want to talk about is called 20s London: Sex, Shopping and Suburban Dreams by Mike Hutton. Now this book is a book I read for research. As many of you know, Project Teacup, the novel I've been working on since the dawn of absolute time, is a 1920s inspired fantasy novel, and while it's not a super duper duper strictly grounded in reality 1920s inspired novel, because it is secondary world and so it is a fantastical magical world, I did want to research the 1920s. I wanted to understand what people were doing and how much things cost. Like, one of the things that I really care about in world building is economics, and I want to understand, like, for an average person, like, how much does a telegram cost relative to like the price of groceries or relative to the price of a vinyl? How accessible is it for people to actually send telegrams? And so this type of thing is one of the logic points that I end up like dwelling on when I'm writing, because I find that stuff interesting and I want to understand how that works. I've read a lot of books from the 1920s and done so much research, but this particular book had so many amazing little details on the 1920s that I wouldn't have otherwise garnered from different books. I borrowed it from the library. Very solid book. Moving along to 2024 then, and I only have one book to speak about for 2024 because everything else has been a reread. I've reread Starting Point and Turning Point this year. I reread The Anthropocene Reviewed, but the one book I do have to speak about is called The Ways of Seeing by John Berger, I think. And I remember really distinctly this quote from the book about vanity and the difference between painting a woman and having her be beautiful for the painter and the viewer, but the second you put a mirror in her hand, it's vanity. Like, the second it's the woman's gaze turned back on herself, it's vanity, but otherwise it's okay. But I remember that exact passage. I remember seeing it on Tumblr when I was 16 and I reblogged it so quickly. I thought it was so profound, and it wasn't until relatively recently that I actually saw that quote again. I think it was maybe on Twitter, and I decided to finally pick up this book and read the rest of it. Now, this book is from the 1970s. I believe it was based on a TV show. I found it really, really interesting. I know that a lot of people sort of say that this book is very like intro to arts history, like it's a little bit shallow because it's just like very entry level ideas. But considering that this book came out in the 1970s, I feel like it's quite ahead of its time. Like, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. And as a person who does not have a background in art history and has never studied anything like this at a formal normal level, I found it really interesting. Hello, editing Christy here, just popping in, rudely interrupting at the end of this video. I'm a little bit nervous that I've made this entire video, and for those of you who have watched my channel for a long time, I'm just kind of repeat recommending non-fiction books that I've recommended before. Like at this point, I cannot remember if I've spoken about these books at length on YouTube or if I've spoken about them a lot on Patreon, because I think I made a non-fiction book video on Patreon and maybe that's messing me up a little bit. Anyway, this whole rambly spiel, basically, I know there will be a lot of new people here, but for the small number of you who watch a lot of my videos and who are waiting for a bunch of brand new recommendations, I do have 4 books I want to mention. Currently in the middle of all of them, I'm really enjoying them, and they'll probably all end up on this list once I'm finished reading them, and I'll probably finish reading them early next year. So I still wanted to make this video, I still wanted to put this video up, but very quickly let me recommend to you Mystery Cults in the Ancient World by Hugh Bowden. I really love history books. I love ancient history especially, and this is exactly what it says on the tin. It looks at ancient cults, forgotten cults. This book has a particular emphasis on Greece and the area around there. I really like the link between cults and festivals. I found that super interesting. I'm almost done and I'm really enjoying it. 50 Sounds by Polly Barton, which I picked up when we were in Japan earlier this year. Polly is a translator. She's translated a couple of books from Japanese into English that I believe I've read. I've only read a small amount of this book. I love the concept of it. It's taken me a little bit longer to get into this, but basically it is a memoir examining Polly's experiences of moving to Japan to be a translator. The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. The only thing that falls down for me with this book is that it's quite spiritual and religious. Like it kind of tackles that angle a lot, and if you're like, it doesn't pick any one particular religion, but if you're not religious or spiritual at all, there's a bit of language here where, like, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But otherwise, I think that there's a wealth of knowledge in this book. I'm really enjoying it. I'm halfway through. I did a very haphazard attempt at The Artist's Way last year. I made a vlog about it, but I would like to give it a go. I'd like to maybe, instead of doing 3 morning pages, maybe just do 1, or maybe just do half a page, maybe get a much smaller notebook. I would like to try this again. And the last one I want to mention is Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. I'm currently reading the audio, or listening to the audiobook version of that. It's really interesting. It's so engaging and fun to listen to. And essentially this is a book about cults and the language around cults. And so far it's kind of examined the cult-like language of certain very popular brands like Lululemon. I don't think it's quite as bad now, but back at least 10 years ago, a lot of the language around that particular brand was a lot more cult-like, and how that's quite similar to some established cults and like the histories of cults, and it's kind of bounced around a little bit. And I've just found this to be such an interesting book and a really good audiobook. But yes, I just wanted to quickly chuck in those 4. And as I've said before, I'm really picky about the books that I will actually recommend to you guys. So it's like, I read a lot, but I don't often recommend most of what I read, because I want to make sure I'm recommending books that I really enjoyed and that I think you guys will get a lot of value out of. That's my spiel done. The few bonus books I wanted to include. Back to the video. I've talked about a lot of these books at some point or another, but probably scattered through many different videos. So this is now my master list of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. I hope you enjoyed it. And also, before I go, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my videos. Without Patreon, I would not be able to be here. As a thank you to my patrons, I post a whole bunch of bonus content, including writing snippets. We have our book club, we have a Discord server, so many amazing things over on Patreon. For the month of December, we're reading 2 books actually, because we picked a really small book, so I put a bonus book in there. If you'd like to check out Patreon, there is a link in the description down below. Take care everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.